Let's have a look. We've got people from Sweden. Hi, Tibor. From Oxford. Hi, Chris. Heather from North Carolina. Ksenia from Bogota. Hi, Ksenia. Michael from Berkeley. Josh from Oakland. Avi from Vienna. We got Richard Saville-Smith here. Hi, Richard. So people from all over. Great to see. Okay, well, we might as well start. So this is the second psychedelic safety seminar. These seminars are organized by the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences Project, and we are a team dedicated to trying to learn more about the risks and harms of psychedelics and what helps people to deal with those harms. We produce research. We also have a newsletter, Ecstatic Integration. And we started doing these psychedelic safety seminars, the aim of which is to connect people writing about psychedelics and psychedelic harms and risks, and to encourage their work and to try and collaborate and address where do we need to work, what do we need to learn, how can we better make this field safer and more mature. Today, we have two celebrated authors joining us to talk about in defense of psychedelic self-experimentalism. So we have Mike J, who is a leading psychedelic historian. Mike has written for the London Review of Books, for the New York Review of Books, many other publications, and his books include A History of Mescaline, and most recently, the book which he's going to talk about today, which is Psychonauts, Drugs and the Making of the Modern Mind, about some of the pioneering self-experimenters in psychedelic history. We've also got Andy Mitchell joining us, who's a neuropsychologist and therapist and author of the new book, 10 Trips, a new reading of psychedelics, which is also about Andy's psychedelic experiments with various different types of psychedelics. So they're going to both be talking for about 15 minutes about their books. Then they're going to ask each other some questions, and I'm going to throw some in as well. And then we're going to open it up to the field. If during the talks you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. And I will feed them to the speakers. So this should be 90 minutes or a little shorter. So I'm going to ask Mike to go first. Mike, I think I need to unmute you, or can you unmute yourself? Oh, here we go. There we are.
Mute myself. All right, am I audible?
Yeah, that's great.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Jules. Okay, that's Psychonauts. That's the book we're talking about. So when I was writing it, I was having a conversation with a 12-year-old daughter, a friend of mine, and she said, "What's this book you're writing? What's it called?" And I said, "Psychonauts." And she said, "Is that like astronauts?" And I said, "Yeah, kind of. Yeah, it is like astronauts, except instead of going into outer space, they go inside and they explore their minds." And she said, "I didn't know that was a job." And she's kind of quite right, you know, because these days, if you're a neuroscientist or a psychopharmacologist or somebody who is studying the effects of drugs on the mind, then taking those drugs yourself is not part of the job description. In fact, kind of rather the opposite. But, you know, for a very long time, you know, from really the beginning of modern Western science all the way up to the 20th century, if you were interested in drugs that had effects on the mind, then a pretty standard practice was to start off by taking them yourself and seeing what they did and writing a description of it. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of modern science with the Royal Society, whatever. Science was always about experiments. That was the whole thing about science when it was new, that instead of relying on kind of, handed down folk tales, you did an experiment, you got evidence, and then you repeated the experiment, and then that experiment was witnessed, so this is right at the core of science. And there were always, from the beginning, some phenomena that were subjective, that you couldn't subject to sort of experiment in the usual way, and self-experiment was the only option. So Isaac Newton is one that I talk about when he's doing all his work on light and color. He got kind of fascinated by what happens if you kind of jab your finger into your eye, like right into your eye socket, and you start to see these visual distortions and strange colors. And he wrote this up as a self-experiment, and he had a bodkin, like a huge knitting needle that he'd stuck into his eye, and he showed exactly how you do it and keyed it all with little letters to show you how that you could do what he was doing, because obviously the colors that he was seeing didn't exist in the real world. They only existed inside his head, so you had to find a way of making that subject to experiment. And that's the way it was. And then the period I really focus on in the book is the 19th century, and the figure who really kicks this off, who was very, very influential through that century, was the chemist Humphrey Davy, who, as a young chemist, one of the very first things he did was his experiments with nitrous oxide. He was not the first person to synthesize it, but he was the first person to inhale it. And then he noticed that if you inhale, you kind of feel a little bit of a tingling. And then if you inhale a bit more, you start to feel very euphoric and full in the head. And if you keep going and keep going, you get to this really, really intense out-of-body experience. And the climax of his experiments was locking himself in inside an airtight chamber and pumping nitrous oxide into it for an hour until he was completely saturated, and then getting out of it and grabbing these two big sort of silk bags full of nitrous oxide and inhaling them. And then he says, he went to this completely new dimension, left his body behind. He was in this new world of thoughts and ideas and associations, where he was just having all these ideas that nobody had ever had before, and decided that nothing existed but thoughts in this new dimension. And so from this point on, the study of drugs was still about pharmacy and chemistry, but it also became about describing the experience. And Davy was very lucky in that the group of people he was working with in Bristol included, young romantic poets, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey, lots of other interesting people. And as Davy said, what we need to do is we need to develop a language of feeling. These are sensations no one's ever experienced before, perceptions that are completely novel. How do we describe them? And this was quite similar in a way to what the romantic poets were doing. They were also trying to find new language to talk about moods and feelings and things that hadn't been expressed before. So, this was, from this point, I think, is when, the study of psychoactive drugs gets very interesting, and self-experiment becomes really central. This is also a time of a discovery of loads of new drugs. So right after Humphrey Davy discovered nitrous oxide, then you had the sort of synthesis of morphine, the first plant alkaloid, and then loads of other plant alkaloids after that. Also kind of travel and exploration and people encountering things that have been used for psychoactive purposes in other parts of the world. Cannabis, for example, hashish was kind of vaguely familiar to Europeans from the Arabian Nights, and all the stories about kind of crazed homicidal assassins, but nobody really had any idea what it did until a French psychiatrist called Jacques-Joseph Moreau started self-experimenting with it with very large doses. At this point, hashish in the Middle East wasn't smoked, it was eaten. And Moreau would eat often, probably 3 grams, a quarter of an ounce of it, and have, really intense hallucinatory experiences that went on for hours. And, he became the great authority on the effects of hashish in the 19th century. And his big book starts, self-experiment is the only way to go. I don't really trust anything anybody says about cannabis if they haven't taken it themselves, and if it's not based on their own experience. Because if you just looked at me after I'd had a huge dose of cannabis, I'd be unable to move or speak, and you might assume that I was in a coma or, sort of sedated, but that would be the opposite of the truth. In fact, I'm just hallucinating so intensely that I can't move or speak. So the spectrum of self-experiment was quite, well ingrained in the scientific method at this point. And then by the second half of the 19th century, which is the period that I'm really focusing on in the book, this is also the period of great fascination with sort of new ideas of the mind. So it's the beginning of psychology as a science. It's the discovery of the unconscious. It's the beginnings of modernism and interest in stream of consciousness and automatic writing and the subliminal mind. And I think, it's no surprise that an awful lot of people who were involved in opening up these new ideas to the mind were self-experimenting with drugs, and drug experiences are a very prominent part of that conversation. History, they seem to have dropped out of history, because we became sort of drug phobic in the 20th century. Then all these drug experiences kind of got forgotten about a bit. But if you think of, probably the 2 huge canonical figures of that time, Sigmund Freud and William James, both of them self-experimented with drugs. Freud with cocaine, and he wrote about, he included his first-person subjective impressions of cocaine intoxication in his scientific papers. William James, his experience of nitrous oxide was very formative for him. It was the first time he'd had anything like a mystical experience. And mystical experience became more and more central to his work as in the decades after that. And in his kind of big crowning book, Varieties of Religious Experience, he talks about his nitrous oxide experience and how it woke him up to the fact that, as he says, our normal waking consciousness is just one form of consciousness. There are all kinds of other forms of consciousness, and simply a kind of lung full of gas or a sort of a bit of a powder or smoke can take you to a different world. And it's not really logical to say that because these experiences are drug assisted, they're not real, because the experiences that you have are real, whatever the cause. And he brought his experiences from nitrous oxide back into his waking life, and it became central to his model of the mind. So, but it wasn't just James and Freud. There are an enormous number of doctors and scientists, as well as writers and philosophers, self-experimenting with drugs at that time. A lot of doctors and scientists were pretty good writers in those days. You had to be, because in the days before tick box diagnoses, description of symptoms was what it was all about. And you had to be able to get patients to describe their symptoms really well. And you had to be able to describe your own sensations and perceptions very well. And a lot of scientists were also poets and novelists. So there's an amazing literature from this time of subjective descriptions of mind-altering experiences. A lot of them with substances that we today wouldn't think of as psychedelic, like chloroform or ether, but which can produce out-of-body experiences. And if you look at the debates around them at the time, they're very similar to the kind of things that people are talking about on ketamine and DMT today. Where did I go? Is this a different dimension? Are these entities real? All those conversations are happening with other substances. And when what we now regard as psychedelics appear, peyote started being experimented with at the end of the 19th century. Then you get, fascinating accounts of it. The first kind of full written description was by Weir Mitchell, who was America's leading neurologist at that point, and he wrote a very, very long description of the effects of peyote, comparing the visual sort of hallucinations and patterns that he saw with the ones that you might get with migraine or whatever. So looking at it from a neurological point of view, and that was read in London by Havelock Ellis, who was a sort of art critic and sexologist, and also a doctor. And if you read Havelock Ellis's description of peyote, it's a fantastically detailed description of the visual effects, with kind of, you know, from an aesthetic point of view, talking about, you know, what it looks like. So, you know, right, you know, at the very, very, very beginning of psychedelic research, it had this enormous richness of people looking at these things from different areas, you know, as doctors, as scientists, as neurologists, as psychiatrists, as artists. And that was kind of, and that all kind of came to a halt quite abruptly at the beginning of the 20th century, which is the time when self-experiment disappeared from large swathes of science, though not all of it. And partly that was because this was a time when drugs became pathologized. This is a period of temperance and prohibition, and so drugs, including alcohol, were thought of as kind of toxic and addictive, and you started to get a negative portrayal of the drug user, who was kind of sometimes a bohemian, sometimes a criminal, most commonly a member of a sort of despised ethnic minority. So once the image of drugs had become so heavily saturated with negative stereotypes, it became much harder for you know, people to sort of pipe up and start talking about their subjective experiences. And at the same time, science took a very sharp turn away from the sort of introspection that William James was interested in, ideas of the stream of consciousness, and, you know, trying to examine the way that our conscious processes work. This was the rise of behaviorism, which is much more solely focused really on the psychology being about how to predict and control behavior. So in the behaviorist context, it was much more interesting to run lab rats around mazes than it was to listen to somebody pontificating about their drug experiences. And then once, you know, by about 1920s, 1930s, things like EEG came along, then there was that beginning of these new devices that could take the output of the brain and turn it into something objective, you know, visible data. And then people got less interested in subjectivity and the subjective experience once there were kind of data by which you could map brain activity. But self-experiment did continue through the 20th century in a couple of very specific contexts, one of which was psychopharmacology. If you're a pharmacist, you know, working in drug discovery, and you synthesize something new, you pretty much have to take it yourself to find out what it's doing. You can't kind of give it to your lab rats and ask them to describe the change of consciousness that they're experiencing. So when new drug families came along, like amphetamines and MDA around that time, you know, they were all discovered by self-experiment. And then the other area that self-experiment persisted in was what we would now call psychedelics, or drugs with very, very interesting perceptual effects on the mind, of which the main one at this time was mescaline, which was synthesized in the laboratory in 1919, and all through the 1920s and the 1930s, there was a lot of scientific work with mescaline in which cognitive scientists took it themselves and described the patterns and hallucinations that they were seeing, and tried to work out, you know, which parts of the brain or the mind might be responsible for that, and also they gave it a lot to people like artists and writers and philosophers who might be able to give good descriptions of it. So that's why people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Walter Benjamin were given mescaline in the 1930s by psychiatrists that they knew, to get kind of descriptions of it and their sense of it. So when what we think of as the psychedelic era started in the 1950s, the self-experimentation was kind of still quite normal practice in that world of drug discovery and that world of psychoactives. So the new psychedelic compounds that appeared in the 1950s, like psilocybin and DMT, were announced by self-experiments of the people who had synthesized them or discovered them, or Gordon Wasson, who'd gone to find his magic mushrooms in Mexico. So self-experiment was kind of central to that. And then, of course, the 1960s is the period in which this disappears from institutional or mainstream science. And the usual narrative about that is, oh, that was because the psychedelic counterculture got going, and Timothy Leary frightened the horses and all that. But I think really the significant event of the 1960s happened before any of that had unfolded. And that was in 1962, and it was the Kefauver-Harris amendments to the FDA, the Federal Food and Drug Association, testing protocols. So these amendments were where randomized controlled trials against placebo were made mandatory, and that first came in, and people became and the drugs had to be kind of it had to be demonstrated that they had biomedical effects. You had to show the pathway by which they were working, which meant that you had to exclude all what were called extra pharmacological variables. Obviously, all this was disastrous for psychedelic research. First of all, because placebos didn't really work. You can kind of tell whether you're tripping or not tripping. But also this extra pharmacological variables was a problem, because it had already been established by this point that was extra pharmacological variables were basically how psychedelics worked. It was now already known as set and setting. So it became very hard to get psychedelics to jump through all the hoops of FDA drug trial approval at this point, and the trials that were running all were slightly different. Some of them happened in hospitals, some of them happened at home, some were large doses, some were small doses. The picture got very, very confused. But particularly in terms of self-experimentation, I think the other thing that the FDA amendments changed, they made it much, much harder to have human trials when you're testing for drugs. Human trials became a thing that you could only do at the very last stage of the process, once you'd done all your tissue trials, once you'd done all your animal trials, and only once you knew exactly what you were looking for. So all this kind of scientific methods that had led to the discovery of psychoactive and the later psychedelic drugs, which was basically people thinking, this sounds interesting, I'll try it, and then recording and describing their results. All that became impossible. A quality drug under the new FDA rules was a drug that produced the same effect or as similar effect as possible in a larger possible cohort of trial subjects. So in this context, self-experiment and subjective description becomes completely irrelevant, because it doesn't really matter what one person's response is. You're trying to get something which is exactly the same for everybody. So I think that was the point at which psychedelics, self-experimentation disappeared from institutional science. But it was also the point where I'd like to talk about one more figure who joins the dots to the present day, and that's Alexander Shulgin, because it was precisely at this point that he had his life-changing mescaline trip and started synthesizing dozens and dozens of different tryptamines and phenethylamines, rediscovered MDMA, discovered 2CB, and so on and so on. And Shulgin was a very principled self-experimenter. He believed it was a crucial part of drug discovery that if you just synthesized a powder, you had no idea what you'd done. There was no way from the molecular shape to tell whether this was going to be psychoactive. You had to take it yourself, and that was the other part of the picture. So Shulgin got together with Anne, his wife, and a bunch of colleagues, and they put a self-experimental protocol together where they would start with every new substance with a small dose and then work their way up and find out what the active dose was. And they had a self-experimental scale of +1, +2, +3, depending on how intense the experience was. And the reason that Shulgin was able to do this was that he was an independent operator. And crucially, he was not trying to license these as drugs. He was not trying to patent the compounds he was producing. He wasn't trying to make any money out of any of this. He didn't need to go to grant funding bodies with ethics committees to tell him what he could or couldn't do. So I think he just produced a very, very strong kind of clean sort of version of the science. And what's interesting to me in conclusion is just how much that speaks in echoes with where the story started with Humphrey Davy, because when he wrote up his nitrous oxide reports, he called them researches chemical and philosophical, and they started, the first section is all about the chemistry and the synthesis and why nitrous oxide is different from nitric oxide. And then he goes on, to his animal tests, and where he, establishes all the physiological basis, how much of the gas gets absorbed in the bloodstream. But then he finishes with, several dozen first-person subjective reports of, what nitrous oxide intoxication feels like. And this is all kind of one volume. And then if you look at Alexander Shulgin's huge door-stopping books, TCAL and PCAL, this is exactly what he does with every drug that he synthesizes. Every entry on it is in two halves, and the first half is the synthesis, and the second half is what he calls subjective extensions and commentary, which is quotations from him or with other researchers saying, okay, this is what it felt like at 65 milligrams, and this is what it was like at 100 milligrams, and so on. So I think he kind of returned really to the source, and I think this is where you get to if you're working in a kind of pure scientific method, is that it's, as David called it, its research is chemical and philosophical. There are two completely different languages here. One is the language of chemistry, and the other is the language of the subjective experience. And these two are not mutually intelligible. You can't get from one to the other, but you need to have both of them if you want to understand what drugs are and what they do. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. That's brilliant and very fascinating, really enjoyable. Andy, so Mike spoke for kind of 20-25 minutes. If you want to take,
oh, sorry. Mm-hmm.
No, we got time. So if you want to take about that kind of time, Andy, and there you go.
Yeah, fine. I probably won't take that long.
Okay, sure.
I haven't got as much teaching to do as Mike, which and the book is, for those who haven't read it, is just a sort of masterpiece of historical detail, backed by the lightest of philosophical touches, and it just works a treat. This is my book, 10 Trips. I've written other books, but I did that under a pseudonym. And I've worked in psychiatry for a number of years, and then moved into neurology and neurosurgery, and thinking about this growing objectification that comes in medicine. Even without drugs, it's incumbent on doctors to keep a large space between themselves and their patients for various reasons, but that includes not really wanting to enter the patient's experience of the world. And certainly within neurology, and to a lesser extent with psychology, these are radically altered states of consciousness that some patients, for example, with traumatic brain injury or different types of strokes enter. And to echo what Mike said, it used to be that neurologists and neurosurgeons would brave attempts to approach that subjectivity via their writing. So I think of the Russian neuropsychologist Alexander Luria, who spent years composing what he called neurological novels out of his case studies. One, The Man with the Shattered World, looked at the brain, the sequelae of a brain injury from a Second World War patient who'd undergone a shrapnel wound that had literally disrupted his sense of reality to such an extent that he mistook his shoulder for his leg. The visual spectrum was chopped up in all sorts of unstable ways. And this went on not for the length of a psychedelic trip, but for a decade. And slowly this man learned the rules of his new engagement, and the neurologist learned them alongside it. And a certain kind of rehabilitation was possible by the sort of courageous interacting with this new altered state of reality, and the kind of emotional softening and hardening and resilience that was built. And I think there's something about that in psychedelics as well, about what is it possible to learn from a psychedelic experience? But just to pause that, my experience of clinical neurology and clinical neurosurgery and clinical neuroscience was that this was very much besotted with a third person perspective, in which neurologists, particularly through imaging, would attempt to understand a condition via the locations in the brain on a neuroimage, via a brief clinical interview, and then the diagnosis made, you were really left to your own accord. Meanwhile, in psychotherapy and psychiatry, and particularly psychiatry, when it was happening in acute settings with chronic and enduring conditions, was really attempt to try and give something back of the self to the person in one form or another, without really knowing what the self meant. There was just a taken for granted sense that the self is the way through the world in one way or another. So we will try and reconstitute it according to our model of what your self should be. And it's not that you have no input, the patient has no input, but we're providing the way of seeing the world, and we'd like you to fall into that. So this was my sort of broad experience of 15 to 20 years of working across these settings. I was therefore very deeply skeptical when in 2018 it came to my awareness that psychedelics were being used to treat different forms of disorder. Skeptical because there'd been no innovation in psychiatry for 50 years, or 40 years at least, in terms of psychoactive drugs, other than variations of existing psychiatry. And certainly there'd been no, there'd not really been, philosophically and conceptually, there'd not really been great steps taken in neurology and neuroscientific thinking to understand aspects of consciousness. There was the hard problem, and that remained more or less intractable. And certainly, even though, as Mike alluded to, there'd been many interesting philosophical navigations in the hard problem earlier on in the 20th century, the idea of philosophers engaging with it at the level of their own experience, outside of formulations for experiments in the third person, was no longer popular. So drugs that could be taken that maybe that would certainly renovate the state of the mental health epidemic, and drugs that may even be the key to the hard problem of consciousness if studied with the right kind of neuroimaging suite. I was sort of deeply skeptical of it for those reasons. The skeptical was more than intellectual, though. I was skeptical because in my case, I abused drugs badly in my teens and early 20s, and alcohol alongside of it. And so for 25 years, I'd not engaged with any drug taking. I took a sabbatical, however, and I took a sabbatical in a way that was aligned with psychedelics, in that I wanted to look at how things like yoga and meditation and other bodily interventions might be incorporated in the NHS in London. And so I was sent off by my manager to India and then to California to consider how one might adapt certain modalities for neurological populations. Could you have a meditation that was tailor-made for a Parkinson's patient, for example? Could you do yoga with intractable epilepsy, for example? And the department were ready to start thinking in these terms, because nothing else was working. They were just other than drug regimens. And I ended up in California, and I bumped into a lady, ended up having a cup of tea with her, and I noticed that her eyes were larger than they should be. And she said that she was microdosing. Hadn't I heard of it? Everyone was doing it these days. And why were you microdosing? Well, it just makes life taste great at the moment. For me, I love it. Anyway, to cut a long story short, this lady turned out to be a quite grounded ayahuascara at a Californian church, which had been set up to protect the church against FDA legislation. And over the course of 3 or 4 weeks, she used a sort of combination of charisma and science and some psychological techniques to persuade me to take toad with her in the hills above Santa Cruz. And so for the first time in 25 years, I found myself sucking on a crack pipe. And then the rest is history. I went from that experience in which I was, obliterated in all the conventional ways, to my publishers and said, I'd like to write a book that involves me taking all of the major psychedelic compounds, beginning in an fMRI laboratory in London on a huge dose of DMT, and ending, as all roads do, psychedelically in the deep south with the shaman. But looking at all of the different models in between as a way of trying to understand what this morass, what this Disneyland of psychedelic utopianism was really like from both the first and third person perspective. And so off I went. And I would say, I mean, in terms of the trip report, I was not systematic in terms of my first person experiencing. I wasn't writing science experiments about each occasion. It became difficult to do that because there was a great deal of compression required, both by the book deadline and by COVID and such like. So I ended up doing, and I know this is a talk that's that has harm reduction as a larger context for it. Well, I ended up doing 40 trips in 60 days with 15 different compounds. I did pay more than some lip service to my own health in that I got a trip sitter to come with me, and I engaged an integration therapist thereafter. And in terms of my own overall report of my psyche at the end of such a thing, then I would say that I underwent some of the most terrifying and exhilarating moments of my life. That the net effect of those experiences have not been the kind of immortal mystical experiences that are reported in some of the literature. That the effects have been subtle and molten and protean. I think there is some superordinate sense that just by spending a lot of time in psychedelic space, I've learned a kind of skill set, a difficult to describe skill set for managing being cornered by life, a kind of species of resilience in which I do not run for the hills when all my past experiences have told me to run for the hills. I'm able to override certain priors, certain ways of dealing with the world that I hadn't been able to deal with before. And even though I was quite dispassionate so each chapter in my book is dedicated to a different experience and to a different context, to a different shaman, sometimes to the shenanigans of a charlatan, and sometimes to the very different kinds of wisdom that are brought to bear, and different kinds of risks that are necessarily involved in the colonial and pre-colonial practices in South America. I suppose that I would say that I became increasingly concerned about the way that psychedelics were being modeled by different discourses, whether it was neuroscience, whether it was mental health, whether it was by recreation or New Age churches, or even by authentic indigenous practices, in the sense that the models are competing territorially for different space, even though and using different languages to talk about the same things, or the same languages to talk about different things, that there's a sort of morass there and a kind of tribalism that takes hold. But crucially, I think just existentially what I felt was that every model has got a kind of ideology that wants to shape the thing, the drug, in its own image, the practice in its own image. And psychedelics are canny in that they give you something of your own image. They lead you to believe that they are the mechanisms for consciousness, or the way that the self can be rebuilt in psychotherapy. And at the same time, they mock the model and shape shift. While they're assuming the shape of the model, they're also saying, hang on a minute, I'm over here as well. So as healthy as I am risky, et cetera, et cetera. And that lesson is folded into it. And it goes back to what Mike was saying. There's an irreducibility, as with quantum mechanics, there's an irreducibility of observer effects. And you will always, as the experimenter, see your self-portrait. And so we, in some form, usually, as John Ashbery would say, via a convex mirror. And I think the other thing that the other sort of take home, and I like that. I find that sort of dishonesty or that anthropomorphism a really interesting thing about engaging with psychedelics. And I think there's something about psychonautical traditions that have been preserved in the West. As Renaissances come and go, there's a psychonautical tradition that just carries on, and that's been alive to the tricksterish quality of them. And I suppose one final thing that I would say is that I think that a lot of the talk that goes on just at an intellectual level is a way of sort of fundamentally protecting us from a kind of vulnerability in the face of things that can't be known, and that and even the sort of corporate extensions of that are a way of really just trying to defend ourselves against that vulnerability in one way or another. I think that's pretty much, I mean, I could go into more details or anecdotes about the book, but I think they're the main teachings I have to say.
Thank you as well, Andy. Brilliant. Maybe we start off for both of you. I mean, you both you know each other and you've read each other's books. Is there a question you would ask each other? Mike, do you have what a question? I mean, like I can leave you to think about it for a little bit and throw in a question for both of you myself.
No, I mean, there's a question that Andy addresses in the book, but I mean, what was so striking to me about his book, there's a lot of my psychedelic journey type books, very few of them are by people who can write as well as Andy can, but also very few of them from people who have this grounding in the neuroscience. So the structure of the book is that it starts with sort of looking at trying to get on clinical trials and trying to understand what people are trying to get out of the science and prove with it, and what's the connection between the science and the therapy. But by about a quarter of the way through, it's asked a lot of very kind of probing questions about that, and it feels like time to move on. And then the book progressively opens up other scenes. It moves out into ayahuasca retreats and churches, and then from that all the way down to down to Colombia and down to the Andes. And what strikes Andy, as he mentions a couple of points as he's moving through this, is that all the scientific stuff and the sort of psychotherapy is all well and good, but what about the rest of the experience? Where's the music? Where's the poetry? Where's the laughs? So I'd quite like to hear Andy telling us a bit more about what he thinks in the psychedelic experience, this kind of scientific therapeutic model captures, and what it lacks and what you need to go beyond it for.
Well, I suppose that just in general, I think that there's a danger of although these we're talking about really powerful psychoactive drugs, there's a huge danger of over attribution, and at the same time a kind of narrowness of attribution. So we say they're about this, they help us to see this, as though this doesn't exist without them. But we all know that all of the thises that psychedelics point to are there, given the right disposition on a good day, to a sober mind, so disposed, whether it's the presence of a tree or the hilarity of the look on that woman's face or whatever. We're just preoccupied in such ways and chemically not disposed to it in the same way. So there's the thisness that's always there. So let's not call that psychedelic in the first place. That's a kind of a laziness and a kind of a fetishism, really. And similarly, just going back to what I was saying earlier, for example, there's lots of things you could say about what Mike's just raised, but if the goal of psychedelic therapy is to piece together the self, I think for most of my time on psychedelics, it was the utter death of self and interdependence of everything that was at stake in one way or another, comically, punkishly, in whatever idiom. It was just ridiculously enmeshed, the experience. Everything was trippy because it was linked into everything else in fractal ways. Now, it seems to me to be just a crazy shoehorning to take that mess where we're all utterly interarticulated and fucked together, to then go back and sit in a psychotherapist's couch and say, I'm a person of strength, and I will leave this room with more agency, and I know how to look after myself in particular ways now, and just to somehow re-individuate or re-pathologize us in the whole, in species, in the specious nature of individuality, for example. So they're two things that come to mind.
And Andy, what about you? Do you have a question you would put to Mike regarding his book or his?
Well, I mean, the first question's like not really a question. It's just like, how on earth, having taken as many psychedelic drugs as you seem to have you just kept your mind together so well to be able to store all of this history and recount it for us? That's you don't have to answer that. Do you want to say something? Good. I do think that it's just really interesting that with a lot of the 20th century has been shaped in the West by this movement from Freud to James in terms of respectable academic psychology, that we've left the Freudian unconscious and his model of the mind to die amongst a few people in Manhattan and in London, but there's something very respectable about James's legacy, and yet, and the way that you set it, I mean, you don't set it up like that at all in the book, but that's just been, and I just wonder, and I know the book it stops short of a full engagement with psychedelics just because of the time frame of it, but I wonder if there was certainly a Freudian way of thinking about psychotherapy, the initial psychedelic psychotherapy with Stanislav Gross and other regression ideas. I wonder if you think there's a way of thinking about psychedelic therapy now as it's practiced, and bringing the unconscious back to it, because as far as I can tell in the clinical trials of psychedelic assisted therapy, it's sort of very deracinated in Freudian terms.
I think that's right. I mean, I think James really came back with the sort of first wave, the moment when the term psychedelic was coined, and really the swing back to him came through figures like Abraham Maslow and Aldous Huxley to an extent, and that was the idea of a sort of positive psychology, and I think that's kind of been quite at the core of the psychedelic movement. There's not a lot to hang on to in Freud if you're about trying to make life more than bearable. If you're interested, in what he calls the oceanic, and doesn't really go any further than that. So I think that's partly what's brought William James back, and I think it's the language in which sort of psychedelic experience can be understood, and that's why I think the word psychedelic was so helpful when it came along, because the word drugs couldn't do that anymore. The concept of drugs, or of taking a chemical to change your mental state, that had been so kind of dumped on by these associations that it was addictive and criminal and foreign. So the word psychedelic, with all its kind of equally positive connotations, that this is all about self-transcendence and peak experience. I think the notion of peak experience became really central to understanding what a psychedelic was, and you can see how much the experience itself actually changed in that moment. If you go back and look at something like psilocybin mushrooms, there are quite a lot of accounts of people accidentally taking what are obviously to us magic mushrooms, before Gordon Wasson and Robert Graves and everybody came up with the idea that this was a psychedelic experience. And if you look at that experience it's very understandable that people who'd kind of eaten a handful of mushrooms that they didn't quite know what they were, the first things they started to feel was like a bit dizzy and a bit ringing in the ears and a bit kind of wobbly in the stomach and sort of stomach cramps. And the first thing you would think was, I've eaten a poisonous mushroom and I'm going to die. So if you look at magic mushroom experiences before that psychedelic moment, they're almost all written up by doctors, and they're about emergency medicine and stomach pumps. And, thankfully we, got the patient back on their feet after sort of 4 or 5 hours, which of course would have happened anyway. And it was only once we had this way of thinking about psychedelics that this was, a portal to the sacred, that this was something that had been used in ancient pre-Christian or non-Western cultures, that this was something that produced an experience that was kind of worth aiming for and shooting for. That's the moment at which, if you like, the drugs start to work, the mushrooms start to work. So yeah, I think, and that's kind of then we're back in the world that William James was talking about, I think 50 years before that. And of course, Tim Leary at Harvard was thrilled to be picking up the tradition as he saw it, the baton from James, who'd also been at Harvard.
Thank you both. So I'm just kind of taking some of the questions that people are putting in the chat, and everybody feel free to put more in. One question was regarding the possible place of psychedelic treatments in health systems, whether that's psychedelic therapy or psychedelic with psychological assistance. What did you conclude from your journey, Andy, and what did you bring back to your department? And what do you both think? Can you see this ever having a place in the NHS or in kind of mainstream health systems, or do you think it might be more of a kind of alternative health fringe treatment?
we were talking about just the issue of where to put it in the hospital. I worked at this sort of large, or I used to work at this large Victorian hospital, and there was in the basement, quite near the morgue, was where the ECT labs were, the electroconvulsive therapy labs, and no one ever went there other than the technicians and the patients. And the way that the conversation's going, at least in the UK, I can see, and I can see the psychedelic rooms would be on the same corridor as ECT, quite near the morgue, near the fire exit, that kind of thing. Certainly not a front door, red carpeted procedure. Certainly and there'd be. And it's again from what I've been reading, as well as particular interest and large scale investment in the 5-MeO DMT as an intervention, because it's short acting, easy. It's a similar length, ironically, as a neurologist consultation. You get about 10 minutes to go through your stuff, and then you're out of the door. So with the cutbacks, I can see why DMT might, if you soundproof the room next to ECT, I could see it getting in that way, but I don't realistically see it being part of mainstream healthcare in the UK, just for the reasons that there's not conceptually or geographically the space to house it in existing ways.
Yeah, I think there's, particularly when I was writing my book about mescaline, which involved more shuttling across between indigenous, healing and Western models of healing. There's a lot of ththings that we don't even think of as a clinical Western framework because we don't see it. We just assume that's what it is. It becomes invisible to us, which I think is quite problematic for psychedelic therapy, and particularly for putting psychedelic therapy into a Western clinical framework. And right at the center of that, you've got the doctor-patient relationship, which we don't even see. We assume that it's normal, but but certainly, my experience with a Native American church, for example, there is no figure like that. This is a figure who is kind of skilled and learned and superior and high social status and costs hundreds of dollars an hour, what does therapy look like with this figure in the middle of it? You know, in the Native American church, you know, there's a roadman who's the kind of a master of ceremonies, but very, very careful to make clear that they don't have any particular status. They don't have any shamanic power. The drum and the rattle and everything before the ceremony starts and after the ceremony gets finished is passed around the circle so that everybody can touch it, everybody can absorb its energy, but also to make clear that, you know, I'm not a special person with special tools. So we've got, you know, the doctor or the therapist in clinical medicine in a way that I think is quite difficult to square and very unhelpful in certain ways, because you know, the assumption then is that the patient is somebody who suffers the treatment, and literally a patient, they lie back and it is done to them. Whereas in indigenous contexts, it's an ordeal, it's risky, it's difficult, and the patient has to meet the you know, the ordeal halfway. And that's really where the therapy comes from. That comes from people saying, I thought I was weak and powerless, but here I was put through this incredibly intense situation and I came out the other side, and my God, if I can do that, I'm more powerful than I thought I was. And what else can I do? You know, nobody comes out of an encounter, you know, with a Western doctor feeling that. They come out saying, well, he thought it'd be better if I changed my medication to this or up the dose. You know, it's always something that's done to you. So I think to really engage psychedelics, you need that. And I think it's interesting in comparison with that to look at, for example, a lot of the veterans groups treating PTSD, you know, with whether it's ayahuasca or MDMA, it's a kind of group therapy. I mean, I guess what it looks like in our culture is not so much clinical medicine. It looks more like NA or AA. But I think that has the crucial components. You know, you're introduced to this group and it's like, okay, we're all here because we've all suffered what you've suffered. We understand what you're suffering and we're working our way through it and getting better. And you're joining us and we're all going to support each other on this journey. And that seems to me a model for psychedelic healing that's much, much more plausible than, you know, come into this clinic, put the eye mask on, we're going to separate you from your friends and your family and your life, and you're going to lie here and have something done to you.
And do you think there is a danger, just touching on that point, of a kind of gurification of the scientist, of the doctor?
What ification, sorry?
Gurufication, that we're kind of...
Well, I was just going to say...
Power and charisma.
I was just going to say, I mean, Mike's got the contrast with indigenous medicine, but even within our existing frameworks, there's a big gap between a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist in clinical settings. A psychiatrist, as Mike suggests, in a sort of Foucauldian way, gives a drug to a docile patient who improves. A psychotherapist interacts with the patient and hopefully the patient improves. And psychedelics seem to haver between the two, and the attempts to model it kind of cross-hatch those two. So on the one hand, does the doctor take the credit and allow gurification? Does the therapist take the credit for putting the drug on the tongue of the patient and being present to frame and contain, and what other verbs he might use or she might use to describe the process? And therefore run the risk of gurification? Or equally, does the therapist feel slightly secretly, tacitly de-skilled by the fact that now their patients, rather than spending after 30 sessions with minimal improvement, are suddenly making leaps? What does that do to their own inner child in terms of their efficacy as therapists? And I just think that these are problems to do with the way of seeing in mental health and the model of seeing.
Thank you. We've got a few questions about the possible place of qualitative, subjective research and data and these kinds of self-experiments as well within the, the modern day psychedelic renaissance. And we should mention, by the way, that that's often dated as starting with Roland Griffith's paper in 2006, sadly passed away just a couple of days ago. Do you think that there is a place for these kinds of subjective experiences? Do you think that they're properly validated in the psychedelic renaissance, or particularly the kind of academic research part of that psychedelic renaissance? Or do you think it's very much been, the emphasis has been on kind of third person objective sorts of measurements? I mean, I think of, well, for example, some of these early, foundational papers, they did have a place for testimony, didn't they? You get the research paper, but then the trial participants would go and do an interview with ABC or CNN and give their testimonies. Though I would say often in a bit of a sound-bited kind of format, because they only had about a minute. So they'd say, well, I was in a real mess, but then psychedelics really saved me. And that would be the news segment. But what do you think? Is there a place already, within the academic research for these kinds of subjective data? Could there be more of a place for it? And one person in the audience said, and might that be a way for more of kind of marginalized voices to give their different perspectives as well? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's I think it's very hard within the sort of neuroscience. I mean, and I think it creates a very odd situation, because there aren't a lot of people working in the science of psychedelics who have not taken psychedelics themselves and who are not interested in psychedelics themselves. And it is kind of obvious that that's what they're there for. That's what brought them there in the first place. But it is very hard to fit in that context, because there's enough kind of problems, as Andy mentioned, the kind of looping effect and the way in which you start to, whatever you're looking at kind of jumps out at you, and, the way in which psychedelics make you very suggestible. And, there's enough of that trying to do it as objectively as possible. And once you start to take psychedelics yourself, and there has been a bit of research that shows that if people knew in psychedelic trials that the researchers had taken psychedelic themselves, they would be less keen to endorse the result. They'd be more skeptical about the results, and I can see that, and I can see that's why it's very hard to for it to take up a place in that third person world. But I think there are places at the margins where it can be much more. I'm thinking of sort of neurophilosophers, maybe like Thomas Metzinger, and people sort of drawing on their psychedelic experiences for more phenomenological or philosophical work, and also anthropologists, people, participant observation in other cultures. But I think in a funny way, it's kind of, if you look back at the kind of subjective description that people were doing in the 19th century, which I think is much richer on this level. I mean, if you're interested in the physiological substrate of the experience, obviously you want to be here in the psychedelic renaissance. But if you're interested in the actual experience itself, I think, where what science today is much drier than it was kind of 100 years ago. And there's much less about the experience itself. But then, of course, it thrives on the margins. And I think this is why, or one of the reasons why Michael Pollan's book was so enormously successful when it came along, was this was the bit everybody was waiting for. Everybody had been, reading these articles about, psilocybin might be useful for depression, or look at this brain scan and how it changes brain function. And that's fine. But what people wanted to know was like what happened when an sort of everyman, or a smart, everyman who was a great writer like Michael Pollan, started talking about their experiences, and the discourse around Michael's book is all about his narration of his experiences. And I think that speaks to the fact that that was somehow missing from the science. But I think it has to be kind of introduced like that these days from the margins, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you. Andy, what do you think?
I mean, there's lots of different facets to this, but I just think about a lot of the sort of neurolocationism in the research of the last sort of 5 or 6 years, which has identified, just the same networks that have been identified for almost everything these days. So the default mode network and salience network are implied in such and such a thing. And these are midbrain structures and blah, blah, these overworked midbrain structures that seem to be doing all of the work for us. Thanks, guys. But there's been little attempts to build on, possible phenomenological accounts within within cognitive neuroscience. And I spoke to Anil Seth about this, and he was involved in some of the early imperial research on identifying locations, and has tried, although it's not his main thing, it has tried to suggest ways that qualitative reporting as to, for example, what happens to visual features in hallucinations might be built into some of the neuroimaging trials and some of the mechanistic accounts for what's going on. But so far, it's been very thin on the ground, that kind of thing.
Thank you. I'm just sticking on the kind of the rather medicalization of psychedelic research. One difference is the lack of voices from the humanities, from writers, from novelists, poets. There's a real lack of that, isn't there, in the psychedelic Renaissance? Do you think why is that? Do we need more non-medical voices? Do you think? I mean, it touches rather on what Andy was saying about how psychedelics play with ideology. Do we need multiple disciplines to try and come close to an understanding of psychedelics? And do we need more voices from the humanities and more artists? Where are the artists in the psychedelic Renaissance?
Yeah, I guess the difficulties with sort of reifying psychedelics and saying the work I'm going to do is going to be about psychedelics. I think there are a lot of artists out there who do great work, which is kind of really interesting if you're interested in psychedelics, and they probably took psychedelics themselves, but that's not the way they frame it. In terms of the academic humanities, I think it's really interesting because you can't look at the history of this without being really struck by, even though these are in some ways the ultimate personal subjective experience, that psychedelic experiences are shaped by context, they're shaped by culture. So Erica Dick, for example, has just edited, it's just coming out shortly, the sort of first big anthology of psychedelic history, which is looking at psychedelic scenes and psychedelic experiences in different times and places through history in different parts of the world, in non-Western cultures. And I think when you put that together, I mean, I always find that a breath of fresh air. It's always great to realize that that precise engagement with psychedelics, which my Western cohort are engaged in at this moment, is not the only way of thinking about them, and that there are so many other engagements with them, and they connect, to social movements or to health or to healing or to all these things in different ways in different times and places. So I think that's very productive, and it's also, I think, the number of people. I saw the number of young kind of medical students going into psychiatry who said specifically that they're there for the psychedelics is enormous. It's like 25% or something, and I think the same is true of the humanities. There's an enormous number of people interested in psychedelic experience and trying to get some handle and some context and some perspective on it. So I think there's every chance that psychedelic humanities would be a popular course in a lot of academic institutions.
Andy, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I suppose just that over attribution of things to psychedelics. I think you think of every poem that's ever been written is like a sort of a creative attempt to conjugate self in context of the world and make unfamiliar associations, bring synesthesias to bear on it. Create tumult in some form or another. And certainly, as I found myself, rather ironically, as the deeper I got into my own psychedelic odyssey, remembering more and more poetry that I hadn't read for 20 years, that it seemed to just, I could, as though I could have spent my entire psychedelic odyssey in a room at my home reading poems, and had at least an echo of the experiences that I had, given the right disposition. So I do think that it's not for poets necessarily to take psychedelics and engage with it. It's more for us to read poetry, for people who are overexcited about all that psychedelics are giving the world. They may already be there in the poems of Wallace Stevens, for example, was one that just kept coming to me while I was in Colombia. It sounds very pretentious.
No, that's brilliant. There has just been a huge grant to Harvard for the study of psychedelics, society and culture, like $14 million. Perhaps we could talk just finally about.
But I just wondered, just on that, I do think, just as someone who's a relative outsider, I think that psychedelics are a fascinating test case about what we as a culture do to new ideas or new objects, and how we'll gather around it and colonize it in with and over attribute it in all sorts of ways, including 40 million pound investments in as though there's the key to it. But really, what the experiment really isn't really the psychedelic experiment. It's what we as a culture do with objects, and how we create newness or admit newness in strange ways and then quickly turn it to something other than it being new.
Right, which is touching on what you're talking about, fetishizing it.
Fetishizing it. And yeah. And I think Mike's book's brilliant on how newness is just repackaged, a repackaged cycle that comes to us every so often when the time's right, when the antidote is most needed. Our unconscious seizes on something and it's already been there before.
Yeah. Maybe we could talk just finally about safety and harm reduction. So it's something we were talking about just before we went live, was the fact that so much research on kind of safety and harm reduction is focused on the medicalized use of psychedelics, which is actually a tiny part of total kind of psychedelic consumption. And there has been debates about how to make psychedelics safer. I look at, in California, the governor of California just vetoed a bill to decriminalize psychedelics, saying he wants to see more safeguards in place, which to some people seem to be steering the legislation towards just the medicalized use of psychedelics. So my question is, do you think and how might we be able to make non-medical usage of psychedelics safer? Most people prefer to trip on their own, for example, but a lot of people like self-medicate as well. Do you think there are ways we might be able to make that safer? We being the general, psychedelic culture, interested parties, harm reduction organizations, public health bodies. So that broad we.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Mike, you might have some specific things to say, but just not from a clinical perspective, but from a rhetorical perspective, I think that sort of deflating some of the hype is generally, albeit remotely, the safest, is a safety-seeking procedure, just so that misattributions and over-attributions and hopes are, I've just to come full circle, I've never seen, working in acute psychiatry, I've never seen a drug yet that's alleviated the material misery of the person who's a long-term inpatient, who's poor and who's got a genetic predisposition. And, I don't believe that psychedelics are going to do that either. And that ripples up through to the general non-medical population. If it's suffering that's, if it's the sort of quotidian suffering that's at stake, psychedelics are not going to be a long-term answer to the bearability of the world. So just at that meta level, reducing the claims for it.
Thank you. Yeah. Mike.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you, Jules. With the vast majority of the sort of conversation about this has been around medical and corporate stakeholders, and how we make that safe and how we regulate this and whether we license the pharmaceuticals. And to me, all that conversation makes perfect sense if the question that you're trying to answer is how do we make money out of this. But I think, as Andy says, it has its limits therapeutically, and lots of people can find their own therapeutic pathways outside it. And the tendency, I think there's a bit of a, within the sort of medicalized world, it's kind of important to overwrite previous understandings of science, of psychedelics. This is not the same as that old hippie shit. This is not the stuff that we were scared of. So there's a tendency there to say, and you always see this kind of as a little disclaimer under everything. Psychedelics should only be taken under strict medical supervision, and anything else, which is usually called recreational use, is dangerous and not to be recommended. And the trouble with that is that just recapitulates the dynamics of the war on drugs. Really, you can't. If you go back to the UN Single Convention in 1961, which set up the global drug prohibition. It's not actually really about prohibiting drugs. Most of it is about saying this is how licensed medical work should go, and this is how coca can be grown under license, and this is how it's all about setting out kind of regulations to make it safer, but within such a narrow remit that the people who were drafted that convention had no idea of the sort of huge scale and size of the black market. But we know already, that with the best will in the world, all the literally millions of people who are interested in taking psychedelics now are not all going to be taking them, in a sort of licensed medical professional kind of highly expensive, context. There's all kinds of other contexts out there. And I think decriminalization is a good first step, but I think it's important to move on from that to a more kind of constructive and positive form of legal regulation. That's the way in which you make things safer, because deregulation, it's good that users aren't penalized, but in a way it's the worst of both worlds. They're left to their own devices, and the market is still given over to criminals who will sort of supply adulterated drugs, or basically whatever they can get away with. I've been doing a bit of thinking with the Transform Drug Policy Foundation, who I've worked with for a long time, who Jules is familiar with, who've done a lot of great work on legal regulation and how it would look. And they've got a guide to sort of legal regulation of non-medical psychedelics coming out very shortly. So check the website or your Twitter feeds or whatever. And they make a lot of good arguments for how a regulatory authority could be very beneficial in terms of kind of equity and social justice as much as anything else, and avoiding corporate capture. There are so many lessons that we've learned from cannabis and also from tobacco and from alcohol about how not to do this, how you end up with a corporate monopoly unless you actively do something to stop that. And I think that's about, I'm a psychedelic pluralist. I think, all these different modalities should be available, and they should all be supported. And I think it would be great to have a regulatory system that kind of gave licenses out equitably, and that allowed for home cultivation of mushrooms particularly. I think, we can see, mushrooms becoming kind of the most easily scalable plant psychedelic in this context. And also foraging, foraging rights could also include foraging exclusions, for example, on peyote, for example. So you could kind of take control of some of the ecological and conservation issues that are really troubling. And then I think you've got kind of various different models for legalization, which might be suitable in different jurisdictions, for different compounds or for different plants. There's a model which you can sort of see starting to emerge in a way. It kind of emerged in Spain with the cannabis clubs once they had this, once you were kind of allowed to grow 3 or 4 plants yourself, then it wasn't long before in some small towns, somebody who was a good grower, everybody was giving their allocation of plants to one person who was growing them and then distributing them once they've grown. And that kind of club or association, I think, is very good because it takes the money out of it. And it would be very nice. I always think, it's much better if psychedelics change hands without money. I mean, it's in a general way, it's good karma, but also in a practical way, that's where most of the problems of regulating and controlling them come from, the fact that these things are commodities with value. And but as well as that, I think there are other models outside drug control. I mean, I think particularly of things like dangerous sports or things like paragliding and sort of mountain climbing, where you have to be part of a society or a club or association to do that. And then they have a license on the basis of, certain undertakings, that they have to do. And that seems to me to be a way of not having to overly sort of bureaucratize this. You can give, if you gave a license to a psychedelic club or association on the basis that they didn't kind of, behave irresponsibly, that the psychedelics they're allowed to distribute didn't kind of leak and went into sort of street sales or whatever, then you'd really be leaving them to kind of license themselves. They could be supplied with psychedelics which they could give out to their members, and they obviously wouldn't want to just give them to anybody, in such a way that it would sort of draw attention to themselves and cause problems, and the whole thing would collapse. So people could develop their own systems. If you joined a club, you would kind of have an initial sort of interview and be scoped out, and if you hadn't used psychedelics before, you might have to have a sober trip sitter for your first trip or whatever. So there's there are models like this, I think, within which psychedelics could be legally regulated, before you then go up to the licensed retail model, which was always kind of seemed a bit implausible. But I think, in so many states where that happens with cannabis now, and everybody's used to, like, every small town having like a little box store on the edge with no advertising or point of sale promotion allowed, and you have to show your ID to get in. I think now that system is kind of up and running and credible. I think that's, it could be extended from cannabis to some psychedelics quite easily. So I think there are all sorts of ways in which, and I would really advocate moving on from the decriminalization of individual users to a system where there's some kind of level of support. I mean, this is so different from when I started, my psychedelic career, when nobody knew anything and there was no internet, and there was absolutely no information, and it was completely chaotic. I mean, I remember the first two attempted acid trips I had. Whatever I bought wasn't acid. It didn't really do anything. I think, that was, in the current situation, you're most vulnerable and encounter most problems with psychedelics exactly at the point where you're starting and you're naive and you have no experience to draw on. So to me, coming from that perspective, the idea of legal regulation and the level of information and, dosage, so just everything that goes with it is I think, something that we can really take forward as a harm reduction measure.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, both of you. Just as a last question, just on education and how we communicate about psychedelics. One of the audience asked, how, as self-experimenters yourselves, as psychonauts, how do you communicate about psychedelics to younger people in your life or in your family, children, nephews or nieces, when they ask you, what's this book about, or what are you working on at the moment? How do you do that in a kind of, I think the person in the audience felt that, in their family, it's a bit of a, somewhat of a controversial issue. So how have you found that, both of you?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult issue, and I'm still learning how to manage it. And I think it's different, with, people have come through, different family orientations around this. There are some people who've always talked about it and some people who never had. I guess I think at this point that, if people are old enough to start thinking about psychedelics, they're probably old enough to jump on the internet and get to Erowid and, just get this fantastic tranche of self-experimental reports that's available to everybody now. When I think of the internet and what I thought it would be, my kind of utopian dreams of it when it started, it's really Wikipedia and Erowid are the two things that are kind of still standing from that era. So, I think that's the thing that sort of, I think people are finding anyway and orientating themselves around. And once that conversation started, it's much easier for the likes of us to, pitch into it and take it further.
Andy, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a complex. I found it very difficult, and I've had to be somewhat disingenuous with my teenage daughters about splitting off my own research for the book from what I say to them. I will say that there was I had one daughter who was very, very sick with a condition that is starting to yield some evidence with psychedelic treatment, and all the evidence was for people above the age of 18. You're not allowed to do clinical trials on people below 18. But she was in a hospital, and hospital was just not making her any better. In fact, she was getting worse. And just doing my own kind of risk assessment about what that would be like to, find a underground way of administering it, I ultimately just decided that whatever the current state of play, it was just not worth the risk of trying that, even though it was quite a parlous situation at the time. And since then, I think I've been much more prohibitionist about their recreational appetites for drugs than I thought I would be, because I'm just scared of the context in which I see them as taking it, that this is going to emerge out of whatever advice I say, it's going to emerge out of peers, usually when they're drunk and vulnerable. And I'm not going to be able to imprint, however reasonable I might sound, a kind of different way of approaching it. So yeah, I don't have a clear answer to that at all.
Okay, well, I really appreciate your time, both of you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these brilliant books as well. Everyone, if you'd like to join me, I see if I can unmute everyone, see if I can figure this out, how to do it. I maybe not. I think this might be beyond me. So you can wave and put your hands up to say thank you and put an emoji. Thank you. I'm going to send everyone a recording.
Thank you, Jules.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, I will send you a recording. And just really appreciate it. I really appreciate your scholarship and your humanity. So thank you.
Really great. Really great. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.